They're somewhere with my flip cell phone, and then I don't know where anything is. I bring them and then I lose one. I have all these single gloves. I have a whole basket full of gloves at home. And I have them, I put them in my pocket and I'll just go into the car, I don't need them until I come here. No, I guess I didn't put them in my pocket. Maybe I thought I did it. Grab stuff and...
It's always cold in here.
Is it?
Mm-hmm. I think it's cold.
I'm not, my body, no, just my hands. Always, anyway, but I'm used to it. The rest of me, it's not that cold outside, it's just a little windy.
Yeah, it's supposed to get more humid.
Well, I thought we were going to snow or something tomorrow. No? I
I
don't know, they keep changing their minds.
I know.
So I guess I'll wake up and see what it looks like.
Let's see what.
Hmm?
Let's see what. Is it gonna be snow tomorrow?
Rain? Snow?
I think more rain. It doesn't.
Tomorrow, snow showers, high 52.
High 52?
Wait a
Yes.
minute. Snow showers, high 52?
Right.
That doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
That's crazy.
25 degree variation, right?
What?
Low 25, high 52. That's what it says.
I think you have to take it hour by hour. If it goes...
Yeah, don't read it down.
Hour by hour?
Yeah, when
In the morning tomorrow, 50 degrees at 8.
Okay, so it's going to be warm. It starts out warm.
Starts warm and
And
it's
then
going to cool off
no,
like that.
no, it's going to, the temperature's going up at night.
Yeah.
Yeah, very little precipitation during the day.
Hey, how are you? And then it's going to drop and we'll get snow. Yay! It's winter. We're supposed to have snow.
Hi, Commander.
Gigantic,
Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah, gigantic.
What?
Gigantic
No,
is
okay.
right. Thank you.
Good. How are you?
I'm looking forward to hearing you tomorrow. I'm
Good to see you. Likewise.
Oh, good.
You know what's really funny? When we watch this in the morning,
Oh, it's okay.
and I just assumed that what you see is what you got. What you got, right. About 12 people. Well, yeah.
Nope, not at all.
It used to be.
I don't know all these habits.
What?
These habits are something to get used to.
I agree. I agree.
And it's pointing in the wrong direction.
I know. It's bad news is what I was gonna say.
The reason I asked is I don't like it.
Avoid people yesterday. Tried canceling the Seder.
No, it's not really.
Trying to get rid of it.
How are you? Hello, good morning. Maybe this one, yes, good. Okay. So, friends, thank you so much for being here. It's wonderful to see more people. It's great. Oh, thank you. Listen, we have consecration today. And so, for those who are joining us online and for those who are here, I just want you to know we are going to be a bit rushed today. And I made a decision that may backfire. I just want you to know in advance and apologize in advance. I have decided not to cut down this session, but to try to figure out how to go through it more quickly. So I'm just going to try to push through this and see how it works out. In the meantime, so that we are able to do this, I am going to request that you be good self-advocates in asking your questions. Make sure that, I see you. For the benefit of those people who are at home or elsewhere, we will repeat the questions. And I've enjoyed the break last week, but I'm delighted to be here. I'm thrilled to be back, and we will be here this week and next week, and we will figure out the schedule for January. We will not be back here for, I believe, the 2nd of January, that weekend of the 2nd of January, and the weekend of Christmas. I believe that on these two weekends, the temple and the Temple Learning Center are shut. And so we want to respect the maintenance and facilities people and IT people and everybody else who wants to take a moment off. So let's do our thing, shall we? Yes? It's wonderful to see you and thank you, and we will start. Let's start with a review. And we had a break for about a week, so let's take a look at this and let's review for a moment. We started talking about the scroll of Ruth, and we started seeing how interesting and complicated it is. Though Ruth initially doesn't seem like such a complicated text because it's such a wonderful narrative. And we decided that we had to read Ruth in the context of the 5 scrolls. In other words, it is in ways part of the biblical corpus and in other ways outside the biblical corpus. In certain ways, it's in conversation with other elements of the Hebrew Bible. And we looked at the book of Judges, we looked at the prophetic literature, we looked at a number of other elements already. And in other ways, it is a counter-narrative to much that is happening in the Hebrew Bible. And we are reading it, and I would like you to imagine this and to think about this for a moment, again, just by way of a review, with one foot in the biblical corpus and one foot out. We are both in the biblical corpus and commenting on the biblical corpus from the outside. This is not only true for the scroll of Ruth, but it is especially true for the scroll of Ruth. And that's how we read this material, and that's part of what makes it so fascinating and interesting. And we're going to start looking at that today in additional detail. We talked about the 5 scrolls, and we talked about the 5 scrolls representing their own kind of group of materials within the Hebrew Bible that are elevated. And they're elevated because we read them on particular holidays at particular times, which means that everybody reads them. And unlike much of the prophetic literature and much of the scriptural literature, in other words, between Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, there are many people who don't read the Ketuvim because they're not part of our Parsha and Haftorah. People don't know them all that well. The scrolls we have to read every year. And these texts speak to love, they speak to wisdom, they speak to faith, and they speak to life and death and to loss. And we spoke about all of these things. And this is really the core of our frame. This is how we read this literature of the scrolls, and this is also how we read Ruth. Ruth is very much anchored in this particular corpus that deals with these values. We're going to talk about this a great deal today, quickly, but a great deal, and we're going to see how that functions today. Then we started reading Ruth, and we started reading the first phrases of the book of Ruth, and immediately noticed a tension. And that tension is between the wording, Vayehi bimei, it was in the days of, right? Or the oath that Ruth takes toward Naomi, right? There's a tension between the words that are typically used in international affairs, among leaders, among kings and vassals, right? And the narrative of the story, which is an intimate narrative of a family. There is something going on here that doesn't match. It doesn't work. The language is the language of high politics. It's the language of states. It's the language of governments. And the story is a story of a family. The story of life and death and movement and security and seeking safety and food. Something here doesn't jive. Something here doesn't work in the language. And there's a tension there that we immediately notice the moment we start reading it, for those of us who read this literature, and we're going to go into that tension today even further. Okay? So there is that. And then we're going to really start. And we're going to start with the additional piece of the frame that we ended with last time. And I want to remind you of that frame through these 3 pieces of art. First of all, Drost, who is a contemporary, as we said, of Rembrandt last time. And I want you to see this, I want you to remember this, because we're going to talk about this today through the text. And I want us to look at this painting and to see the intimacy in the conversation. You can see the hands raised, you can see the eye contact between Naomi and Ruth. You can see that there is a conversation taking place. There's discourse occurring. You can see how this functions here, right? There is an intimacy and a conversation, there is real discourse between these two people, between Naomi and Ruth. And there is a kind of negotiation taking place here. What you also see is that they're wearing plain clothes. Remember, we spoke about this. This is not royalty, these are people. These are two women having a conversation. You see what we're talking about? Can everybody, you remember us talking about this? Okay. Then we looked at Blake, the poet, the artist. We looked at Blake, right? And this, we talked about this being discovered. This now, as I told you, there's two versions of this. One is in Liverpool, the other is in Cambridge. But what you have here are religious figures. Notice the halo, right, over Naomi, right? What this is an allegory, right? These women are not just women who speak to each other. They represent something more than these women. Look at the coloration. Look at the facial expressions. Look at the fact that there is no discussion. There is no intimacy. There is no eye contact, right? And look at the movement here with Orpah facing one way, Ruth embracing Naomi, and by the way, look at where she is embracing her, right? She's not at her neck or at her face, right? Right? I mean, and we're going to come back to this, right? But look at the rejection on the one hand, the embrace on the other, the pain here. Look at the hands outstretched. What you have here is an allegory. It's a religious allegory. What you have here are figures that represent more than the figures in this piece of art. Again, I don't want to belabor this because we spoke about this last time, but I want us to remind ourselves of what we said. And then, remember Calderon, right? And this is in the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. Remember the Calderon piece. And remember what we said about this. And remember what looks like, I mean, lovers' intimacy, right? Between these two women. Look at the way, I mean, this romantic, almost erotic embrace between these two women. Yes? Look at the scene here, right? With Orpah, effectively a bystander, right? Who is witnessing the love between Ruth and Naomi, and who also is on the outside, right? Who's not quite in that circle, right? Who's not quite in that embrace. Look at all of this happening all at the same time. And you know, this notion of the path, right? That leads eventually Naomi and Ruth to be walking on the path together, and Orpah to take her own way back. Yes? Okay, so we talk about, on the one hand, conversation, negotiation among regular people. On the other hand, we talk about this as an allegory, a religious allegory, right? And here we talk about what is almost an eroticism, what is really a love between these. So already here we are using this art to create for ourselves this frame that we're now going to be using. Okay? All right? So let's take a look. Let's see what we do here. Let me see how quickly I can take you through this. I'm going to be challenged, but we're going to figure it out. So, I'm sorry? Of course. Is it in your way? Okay. Okay, and we're going to use the microphone for questions. By the way, any questions, feel free to ask as we go, and here we go. All right? Good. We are back to the first chapter of the book of Ruth. Can you see the screen? Yes, it's sufficiently? Okay. We are figuring out the large screen. It's not yet fixed. The moment it's fixed, we're not going to have to use this. So we're back to the first chapter of the book of Ruth. And we are now looking at the moment before that oath of allegiance of Ruth to Naomi. Okay? And Naomi is trying to tell her daughters-in-law to leave and to go back. Now, we have to look at this carefully. We didn't do this last time. The language here is extraordinarily important. Ruth chapter 1, does anyone have a page number? 1419, thank you very much. For those who are using books, 1419. And it's very important what she says. She says, Ha'od li vanim beme'ai. Do I have children in my guts? Is it possible for me to bear more children? Can I have more children in my womb? Do I have more children in my womb, right? She says to her daughters, turn back. Why should you go with me? Have I more sons? It does say technically sons. In my womb, in my guts. It says in my guts. Me'aim are guts. Who might be husbands for you. Turn back, my daughters. For I am too old to be married, and too old to be married means I am too old to have children. That's what it means, right? I'm too old to be married. I'm not marriable anymore. I don't believe that I have the capacity to have children, right? That's argument number one. Now we turn to argument number two. This was written by a lawyer. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I were married tonight and I bore sons, should you wait for them? Wait a minute. A moment ago you couldn't have children. You say, do I have children in my guts? I'm too old to be married. It's not going to happen. But even if it did happen, even if it did, should you wait? Right? Is it appropriate for you to wait? Would it be the right thing for you to wait? Right? And then there's a third argument. On account of me and even the remote possibility that I might have additional sons for you to marry, should you, in a sense, set yourselves apart from the possibility of being married to other people in the meantime? Is it in your best interest? There are three arguments here. I hope you see it, right? They build on each other. One, I am not going to be married. There are going to be no more sons. Number two, yes, technically we are a family. You were the wives of my sons. Therefore, we are linked. And if I did have children, you would be the first women who would be eligible to marry my sons. Right? This is what family means here in this context, right? But are you going to wait? And number three, are you going to wait and exclude the possibility of marrying others in the meantime? Yes? So far, so good? Yeah, do you understand what is happening here, right? In other words, she says to them, number one, there's no more children here. Number two, even if there were, you really shouldn't wait for them, right? We are a family and all the bit, but you really, you should not assume the risk. And number three, you should be actively looking to marry others. Yes? I want us to see this, and I want us to understand the implications of this and why. And this is where we start from, and this is where we're going to end. And the why is, Ha'od li vanim be'me'ai. That is the why. What is the why? My womb, my body, the way I am right now, I cannot help you. Right now, there is nothing for me to give to you. My two sons have died. My husband has died. I cannot provide for you. I cannot provide for safety. I cannot provide for financial security. I cannot provide for a future generation for you. I cannot provide for you. This is the message, right? Now, this is not just the message. There's more to this than just, this message. Ki mar li me'od mikem, the text says, for I am very embittered by you, by your condition, for you, on your behalf. I am deeply embittered by this situation and its implications for you. Right? Ki yatz'avi yad Adonai, for the hand of God has come out against me. So, of course, some of us read this and it's tears every time because, the language is the language and the bitterness is the bitterness and it just jumps out of the page. It's just, right? And at the same time we read this and there is something about this that is striking and that we need to talk about. And we're going to start with the green element, Ki yatz'avi yad Adonai, for the hand of God has come out against me. We're going to start with that because that's very, very unusual language. And we're going to talk about why this is unusual language and what this means. Okay? Bear with me and we're going to talk it through. So far, so good? Yes? Do you see where we're going? Okay. We are going to start from the book of Isaiah. And I'm going to make the case to you that the language of Yad Adonai, the notion of the hand of God coming out for or against, is a notion that is used in, again, international affairs, in world affairs, in ways that are earth-changing, that have cosmic significance. And in the context of which we have to ask ourselves, why is she using even Job doesn't use this language. No one uses this language. So the notion of Yad Adonai and what Yad Adonai here means, we have to for a moment talk about. I'm going to do this quickly, right? This is the book of Isaiah, and I have to show this to you. I have to share this with you. Chapter 51 of the book of Isaiah is magnificent. For those of you who don't know it, does anyone have a page number? 728. Thank you very much. For chapter 51 of the book of Isaiah, please read chapter 51. It's absolutely magnificent, right? This is Israel and the prophet calling upon God to wake up, to come back, to help us out, to bring back God's splendor, God's magnificence here on earth, right? There are words we don't understand here. The word Rahav, we don't fully understand. There's a huge debate among the commentators about what this means. You, God, were the one who hacked Rahab, pierced the beast, right? This large alligator. You dried the sea, the waters of the deep, made the abysses of the sea a road the redeemed might walk in. You, God, are able to do all of this. Where are you, God? Wake up. Wake up, God, right? This is how the whole thing starts. Come back to us, come back to Zion, right? Okay. And Isaiah says, and this is in the context of the destruction, I am God that comforts you. What ails you is that you fear humans who must die, mortals who fare like grass. This is your problem. What are you doing following human beings? What are you doing just looking at what is happening around you and not looking above? Right? Have you forgotten God your Maker who stretched about the skies and made firm the earth? You live in constant dread because of the rage of an oppressor who is aiming to cut you down. Yet on what account is this happening? You keep looking at the details. You keep looking at what is happening around you. You can't think why. By the way, there's a group of us rabbis who study. This is one of the things we're studying in the context of, this season in our lives, right? The end of 2021, the beginning of 2022. Where are we? What are we looking at? And to what degree are we even capable of understanding context? How does this function for us? Yes? But we could talk about this a great deal. This is not the point of today. And we will talk about this another time. And then it says, rouse Jerusalem, arise Jerusalem, you who drank from God's hand the cup of wrath. Remember, Jerusalem was destroyed. What happened here with the hand of God? What did the hand of God do? It destroyed Jerusalem. It destroyed the temple. It expelled an entire people. This is the hand of God. Right? This is what the hand of God does. This is the kind of language we use with regard to the hand of God. Think about Naomi saying, the hand of God is against me. Really? Where is the hand of God used? Here. Right? Right? So, Zion here, we are moving to the from the second person to the third person. She has none to guide her among all the sons she bore. None takes her by the hand, all of the sons she reared. And then we move back to the third person, also in the Hebrew. Your sons lie in a swoon at the corner of every street, like an antelope caught in a net, drunk with the wrath of God, with the rebuke of your God. Right? This is what is happening here. And listen to this, wretched one, you who are drunk but not with wine. This, by the way, every chapter has a few of these verses that really get to you, that get to me, I should say. You who are drunk but not with wine. Thus says the source of life, your God who champions God's people, I will take from your hand the cup of reeling, the container of my wrath. You shall never drink it again. Enough. Enough. You've suffered enough. Isaiah says it's going to be okay. The suffering will be over. Eventually, we will get back. This cup of wrath that Zion drank from, enough. Right? But how's the hand of God being used here? What is the hand of God? An entire nation, an entire government, the priesthood, the temple, everything is gone. This is the hand of God. By the way, do you remember the hand of God in Exodus chapter 9? Not outstretched arm, Exodus chapter 14, Zroa Netuya, very good. But what about the hand? What about the hand? Yad Elohim hoya b'miknecha. Moses says to Pharaoh, the hand of God is destroying your entire flocks in chapter. Remember the hand of God in chapter 16 of the book of Exodus? You remember that? Would the children of Israel after the Exodus, they're now in the desert, they're across from the Red Sea, they're just in the desert now, and they're saying, would that we had stayed in Egypt and died by the hand of God, by the flesh pots of Egypt. Right? That's the hand of God. Killing an entire nation. Would that we had been destroyed by the flesh pots of Egypt instead of being here in the desert without any food. Right? Remember, this is the hand of God. There is also a positive hand of God. We can talk about the hand of God positively. Right? The hand of God in terms of the ability of the prophet to prophesy. Right? But the hand of God always has cosmic political significance. Yes? And here it appears in the story of Naomi and Ruth. We're wondering what is going on here. Why is this taking place? Okay. Moving forward. Numbers 11. Look at this. I just want you to see this very briefly. I'm just going to rush through this. Moses is in the desert. The children of Israel are moving away, right? They're at Sinai, moving away from Sinai, and there's 600,000 people who need to be fed. And Moses says to God, you said you would feed us. How are you going to feed us? Where are the flocks? There's not enough fish in the sea to feed 600,000 people. How are you going to feed us? What animals are you going to be using to feed us, right? And what does God say to Moses? Will God's hand fall short? What do you make of me? What do you think? You doubt me? But what is the language? Will God's hand fall short? Yad Adonai tiktzar. Will God's hand fall short? Right? Amazing, just extraordinary. Again, the language. But for 600,000 people, 600,000 people, right? Take a look at this, the book of Chronicles. I'm mentioning this because very few people know that there was a prophet called Gad, G-A-D. And we don't read about this prophet in the book of prophets, we read about him in Chronicles. And here's the story in very brief. Again, I'm going to just rush through this. David ordered a census. He ordered for everybody to be counted, except God had not asked him to do so. And God got very angry. God did not want the census. And he sends the prophet Gad to David. And he says, you can choose among three things. You can choose a famine. You can choose to be defeated by your enemies. Or you can choose some kind of 3 days of the sword of God, pestilence in the land, the angel of God wreaking destruction throughout the territory of Israel. You get to choose. What would you like? Right? It's lovely. Very nice. Right? It's a lovely choice. Famine, defeat, and pestilence. Right? This is where, right? David says to God, I am in great distress. Let me fall in the hand of God. Yad Adonai, yet again, right? For God's compassion is very great, and let me not fall in the hands of humans. God sent a pestilence upon Israel, 70,000 people were killed. This is what we talk about when we talk about the hand of God. I want you to have a notion, a sense of what we're talking about with regard to the hand of God. And why it is that we read the story of Ruth and Naomi and we think, what is going on here? What is she talking about? Right? Now, there's a little bit more here that I just want us to come back to, which has to do with wisdom. So David, okay, anyway, I don't know whether we have the time to go through all of this, actually. But David eventually says, it's my fault, I had ordered the census, let the hand of God fall on me and not on all of the other Israelites. Again, this is the chapter and eventually God relents. David prays and eventually God relents, and that's the story. And but again, it's the hand of God, and that's how it's being used here. Look at Proverbs. Now, this is really interesting. And by the way, we should look at that chapter anyway. Proverbs 21. We're going to come back to Proverbs 21, and it's a magnificent piece of text. It's a very important piece of text. And we're going to understand it. We're going to read quite a bit of it later on, but not in the coming weeks. Like water in a stream is the mind of the king in God's hand. In other words, the way God directs a stream of water, God holds the minds of those who lead countries in God's hand. God directs as God wishes. And then it becomes really interesting. That God is in control, we understand. We get the theory. We know what the thinking is. Now it gets more interesting. The paths of humans are seen clearly in God's eyes, and God probes the mind. Now here we move a step forward. Here God doesn't just involve God's self in human affairs that are political, that are of cosmic significance. 70,000 people, an entire country here, 600,000 people there. Egypt, no. God enters into our minds and into our hearts. Here we have, in the book of Proverbs especially, God being a personal God. Now God is looking into us personally. That God decides that 70,000 people should perish is one thing. That God takes into account what I think and what I feel is quite another. Right? Look at this. It's quite remarkable and revolutionary. Right? To do what is right and just is more desired by God than sacrifice. In other words, the externalities are externalities. But what is important is to act and to think correctly. Yes? Okay, again, this is quite revolutionary. Haughty looks, a proud heart, the tillage of the wicked is sinful. Right? Remember what we have here. Haughty looks, that could be apparent to other people. Right? The heart is not apparent to other people. Right? And the tillage of the wicked, the tillage is an action. It's actually something that's out there in the world. Right? You have looks, you have internalities, and you have physical realities in the world in one verse. Right? That are sinful. The plans of the diligent, that the diligent make only for gain, those are the plans of the diligent that are made only for gain. All rash haste makes only for loss, and treasures acquired by a lying tongue are like driven vapor, heading for extinction. The violence of the wicked sweeps them away, for they refuse to act justly. The way, now this is the key to the entire chapter, and we're not going to go through the entire chapter, but just talk about this for a second, for a moment. The way of humans may be tortuous and strange. Don't judge. Our way may be very strange. It may be unpredictable. We may not know what comes next. We may be going through all kinds of vacillations and directions in our lives. We may be hitting all kinds of issues, all kinds of humps. There may be all kinds of things that happen in our lives that are tortuous and strange, though their actions may be blameless and proper. Don't judge people because you don't know. Don't look at how they do. Don't look at the paths of their lives and say, oh, I know what's going on with you. This is remarkable. Remarkable. Now think about Naomi. Remember, this is a scroll. And remember that this is part of a conversation with the wisdom corpus. Think about Naomi now. And think about Naomi saying something about the hand of God. And think about Naomi having lost her husband and having lost her 2 sons. And think about Naomi in this kind of situation feeling afflicted by the hand of God. There is something here about the hand of God that is very unusual in the way that it's used in the book of Ruth with regard to Naomi. And we are going to figure out why. We're going to understand why. But not quite yet. For the time being, we are raising the question. And we're seeing what is happening here. Yes? So far, so good? Okay. Now we talked about the hand of God, right? Yatzavi has emerged, has come out against me. That notion of the hand of God. But we haven't spoken about the bitterness yet. Let's take a look for a moment at the bitterness. I'm a little bit challenged because I would love to spend more time on all of this, but now I'm taking you to what really is one of my, I think, 10 top favorite texts in the whole of the Hebrew Bible, Isaiah chapter 38. By the way, Yad Adonai, there are a whole number of different places. Yad Adonai with regard to prophecy, Ezekiel chapter 37, Yad Adonai. Ezekiel experiences Yad Adonai, the hand of God, in offering prophecy that then predicts the rebuilding of the temple and the return to the land of Israel, to the land of, right? We have that Yad Adonai. Isaiah chapter 40. Remember Isaiah chapter 40? Nachamu, nachamu ami. Does anyone remember that? Comfort ye, Jerusalem. Comfort ye, my people. Does anyone know the Messiah by handle? Yes? Comfort ye. Do you remember comfort ye? That's chapter 40 of the book of Isaiah, right? Ki lakham yad Adonai kiflaim mikol chatotea. For Jerusalem has taken twice from the hand of God punishment for its sinfulness, right? So chapter 40 includes Yad Adonai. There's a whole number of other places where Yad Adonai occurs. Kings 2, chapter 3, Yad Adonai. There's a number of places. This is magnificent. This is about bitterness. King Hezekiah is a good king. And King Hezekiah is challenged. And as you recall, King Hezekiah is that king who is threatened by Assyria. He's the Judean king, he's the king of Jerusalem. He's threatened by Assyria, and Assyria is about to run him over. Assyria is about to conquer Jerusalem and destroy it. And Hezekiah becomes very sick. And Hezekiah is told by Isaiah that he's going to die. And he prays. And he consults with Isaiah, but then turns to the wall and prays to God. And he does not die. God saves him. Not only does God save him, God tells him that he is going to be saved. That he's not going to die. And he survives, and Jerusalem survives. This is one of the, again, this is a magnificent, not just piece of text, but piece of narrative of a person who sees himself being right on the verge and who emerges and regains his health, the king who regains his health, right? And then he writes a letter, he writes a poem about this. And the poem is here in the book of Isaiah, chapter 38. And this is the poem or the piece of writing of King Hezekiah, this magnificent piece of writing. When he recovered from the illness that he had suffered, he was on the verge of death. I must depart in the middle of my days. I've been consigned to the gates of Sheol for the rest of my years. I thought I'll never see God in the land of living or even behold people again. My dwelling was pulled up and removed from me like the tent of shepherds. I have a rabbinic colleague whom I've known for a very long time, whom I went to visit in a hospital somewhere else, who used this verse with regard to the experience of being hospitalized, the experience of being outside one's home, of being outside the familiar, of being outside a structure wherein there's any control, right? Where it feels like everything's been wrapped up around me and I am no longer in my surroundings. I have no anchor, right? Very powerful, right? The dwelling being pulled up. My life rolled up like a web and cut from the thrum, cut from the core, right? Piece there. Only from daybreak to nightfall I was kept whole. It was as though a lion were breaking all my bones. This was how it felt. I cried out until morning. I moaned like a dove. As my eyes all worn looked to heaven, my God, I'm in straits, be my surety. I mean, look at this description of the pain, of the illness. There's little that's more powerful than this. God, for all that, and despite it, my life breath is revived. You have restored me to health and revived me. Now here comes the really important piece. Here it is for peace. Here it is for wholeness. And the word in Hebrew is shalom. Hinele shalom is what the Hebrew says. Here it is for peace. Here it is for wholeness. I had experienced bitterness upon bitterness. Mar li mar. Bitterness upon bitterness. I had been at the doorway to death. We're going to come back to this in one moment. I had experienced that kind of bitterness, and you saved my life from the pit of destruction. Remember this? Remember bitterness, the illness, and the death. Yes.
I'm remembering, like I was thinking originally about when you talked about when they crossed the Red Sea, first they had to step before it was parted, right? So what I'm seeing is there are the people who took it upon themselves, like to do the census, and that didn't go well. And then there are people who turn it over and do their part, but turn it over, and that seems to turn out better.
So thank you so much for this. I'm going to repeat the question so that the people at home can hear it. There is a theme here, right? I think it's fair to say, Deborah is suggesting there's a theme here. And the theme is that when we seize the initiative and we do things that are beyond God's command or that God may not approve of, it doesn't necessarily go well. And it also entails anger, and it entails punishment, and it entails a whole number of different things that might occur afterwards that are not particularly helpful, right? Having said this, when we turn to God, the other side of this equation is that when we turn to God, when we relinquish control, when we try not to do things on our own, it so happens things seem to go better. And we are able to recover, right? And if you read the chapter, you will see that Isaiah speaks to Hezekiah. Hezekiah then turns to the wall, which means that before that, when Isaiah spoke to him, he was literally with a back to the wall, right? And then he turns with his face to the wall. There is nothing there. He is at the wall. And he speaks to God, and he prays to God, right? And this notion of returning to God. Thank you for this. Thank you for this comment, right? But you see what is happening here. But I want you to maintain this notion of the bitterness. I want us to talk about the bitterness because I want us to go back to Naomi, right? And her bitterness and the hand of God striking her, right? And what the bitterness is about. Yes? And the bitterness is about death. It's about the experience of death. We are at the door of death. We are feeling death coming. This is the Mar Limar. And then Hezekiah is pulled away from death to life. Yes, Roman.
Why God is upset with Moses. And we say, why would we let
Hmm. Yes.
How is he going to prove? That's a. And he
Yes.
doubted God. How am I going to? How are you going to provide basar, meat for us? So maybe that's more powerful than say he didn't listen to God.
Well, so the question here is, and I'm just going to repeat it very briefly, Roman, thank you. It's with Moses we have a similar situation, but we have a situation with Moses wherein we are told that the reason he didn't cross over to the promised land, he didn't make it into the promised land, was because he did not follow God's instruction with regard to the rock and the water, right? And he struck the rock as opposed to, right? Whereas what you're saying is we have examples of Moses actually not trusting God, not having this complete faith in God, in the context of all the miracles, still doubting that the food is going to be there, still doubting that there's going to be the meat, that there's going to be the fish, that all of this is going to come in, right? And there's the question of doubt and of insecurity here that may explain the reason for which Moses does not cross into the promised land. And this is related. This is a related question to the question that Deborah asked. And yes, we are called to a standard of faith that is so elevated, that is very difficult to achieve. What rational person does not examine her or his situation to see what things are like in order to evaluate what next steps to take? Right?
Thank you.
And here, this is the standard to which we hold Moses, right? Who ends up not crossing into the promised land, right? But even Moses, at the very last moment, in the book of Deuteronomy, right? In all of these places where Moses comes in, does Moses talk about that bitterness? Mar limar? This is about the experience of that illness. The experience of, I know what's coming. Right? This is, and which Hezekiah is pulled away from. And Hezekiah is still young, right? Hezekiah says, I'm in the middle of my life here. Suddenly I've fallen ill. Oh, okay, yes? Okay. And then Hezekiah says something here in this poem, which now allows us to understand that the poem was written by the psalmist. And this is the smoking gun, as it were. Sheol will not recognize you, God, nor the land of the dead extol you. Sheol is another word for the land of the dead in Hebrew. Nor will they who descend into the pit seek your truth. In other words, you remember the Psalms? Hashamayim shamayim ladonai v'haaretz natan livnei adam. The heavens are for God, the land God has given for human beings. Lo hametim leha hallelujah v'lo chol yordei duma. The dead will not praise God, nor those who descend into silence. Ve'anachnu nehalel me'ata v'ad olam. We shall praise God from now and on to eternity. Right? Hallelujah. Yes, you remember that? So the similarity here suggests that the psalmist wrote this magnificent poem, right? But remember the bitterness. Remember the bitterness. And what is the bitterness about? And what is happening here, and what is the tremendous human story that we read here in the scroll of Ruth? Why is it that we're looking into all of this? What is it that we're really looking at? Ha'od banim li v'mei. Are there children in my guts? I have just experienced unspeakable loss. My husband and my 2 sons. I have had a life. I have been married, and I have had children. And there is no future. Naomi says. I, she says, cannot redeem you, my daughters-in-law. I cannot help you, my daughters-in-law. My womb, my uterus cannot save you. I will not have children for you. This will no longer happen. Right? And so the bitterness is what bitterness? It's the bitterness of the wall. It's the bitterness of the end of the road. It's the bitterness of no future. But it's not the end of the road, and it's not the wall, and it's not no future for Naomi. It's for her daughters-in-law. The bitterness is there. What we see here in this particular element in chapter 1, verses 11 to 13, is the kind of bitterness that is associated with a sense of impending death. We remain with the question of the hand of God, of what does it mean that the hand of God has come out to strike Naomi? What does Naomi mean by this? And we're going to get there. We're going to talk about this. But right now we're on the bitterness. And the bitterness is this perception of death. And what is Naomi's perception of death? It is no longer in her power to bring about life. You know, we live our lives with a hope for the future. We believe in future generations. There's no point in this otherwise. Right? And here is the bitterness. And where does it start from? It starts from our guts. It starts from Naomi's gut. It starts from Naomi's womb. Naomi is to provide a redeemer for her daughters-in-law, and she can't. And here comes the genius of the scroll of Ruth. Right? Ruth chapter 4. Now go to Ruth chapter 4. What page is Ruth chapter 4? 1423, page 1423. Boaz married Ruth, and Ruth became his wife, and he cohabited with her, and God let her conceive, and she bore a son. And the women, we'll talk about that too. The women said to Naomi, "Blessed be God who has withheld a redeemer from you today. May the Redeemer's name be perpetuated in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain your old age, for he is born to your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons." Wait a minute. Whose child is this? Ruth's child. Naomi was supposed to be Ruth's redeemer. It was Naomi's gut and Naomi's womb that could not provide a redeemer for Ruth. What just happened here in chapter 4 of the book of Ruth? Everything is inversed. The entire situation's turned on its head. Who is providing a redeemer for whom? It's Ruth providing a redeemer for Naomi, not Naomi for Ruth. What are the women here saying? Oh, Ruth, look, you have remade your life. Your husband had died, you now are remarried, you have a child, let us celebrate with you. No. Where is Ruth here? Who's been redeemed here? Who's been saved? Naomi had been bitter for Ruth in chapter 1. Look at what happened here in chapter 4. What is this? No, Naomi's womb could not have any additional children. But Ruth was able to. And suddenly the story turns. And it's Naomi who is redeemed through Ruth rather than Ruth through Naomi. The bitterness of the end of life, that wall, suddenly becomes more distant. Naomi is pulled away by this child who is born to Ruth. And who now takes care of that child? Where is his mom? Where is this child's mother? Whose child is this anyway? As far as the community is concerned, as far as these women are concerned, it's Naomi's child. It's Naomi's redeemer. Right? And we're going to talk about this again in the context of other biblical stories. But I want you to see what just happened here. And why this story and the scroll of Ruth represents a story of redemption. And how the redemption is precisely that which we would not have anticipated. Who was supposed to be redeemed? Ruth and Orpah. And look at what happened here. The genius of the scroll of Ruth. The genius of this. Right? There is a future. Yes, Deborah.
You can make the case that when all that tragedy befell her, she didn't want to hold on to that for her own sake. She said, for your sake, right? She was embittered on their behalf. For your sake, go forward and find, right? And that comes back to you, because that's turning it over as well. You see, as opposed to holding tight to them like, you're all I have, she let them go for their sake, and it came back to benefit her.
Well, so I'm going to repeat Deborah's question. The question is wonderfully stated, wonderfully presented. Is it possible that because Naomi was selfless, I'm putting words in your, forgive me, because Naomi was selfless and thinking about her daughters-in-law and was focused on their loss and not on her own loss, is it possible, is it conceivable that as a consequence of that, that goodness that she expressed towards them, that she showered upon them, is goodness that came back to her in eventually her being redeemed? Yes, but. Wonderful, wonderful way to express this. But. Who says that she's bitter? Naomi. And twice. Naomi says that in chapter 1, that she is embittered when she speaks to Ruth and Orpah, and 7 verses later says it again when she arrives back in Bethlehem in Judah. She says, do not call me Naomi, call me bitter. Mara. Exactly right. Call me bitter, Mara. Right? In other words, who is the protagonist of this story? Who in this story is truly redeemed? Is Ruth ever Mara? Does Ruth say, I am embittered? Something very interesting is going on here. There is a literary trick that is being played on us here in the book of Ruth. That is not a trick. It's a theological statement about redemption. And about redemption that occurs through future generations. And about the bonds that are created through the prospect of new life. Right? And here we want to pause. We want to think about this for a moment because we didn't see this coming. Ruth is not led through the story to marry with Boaz for Naomi's sake. Throughout the story, it is for Ruth's own sake. And Ruth is suddenly absent from the very last chapter of the book of the scroll that bears her name. A redeemer is born to Naomi, and Naomi becomes the caretaker to that child. And there's more that we're going to eventually talk about. Yes.
One of the things I'm pulling from all of these stories is the idea that essentially bitterness is about men. And that we are insistent that our way of being redeemed be our way, but that we have to accept that we may be redeemed, but some other way than what we expect. It's not going to be our own baby that we have again and again, but our baby's baby that we live through. And accepting it's not going to be the way we planned it is what we have.
And not only that, so let me repeat the question yet again, just for the benefit of those who are watching us. The notion that redemption, it's not a question, it's really a comment. The notion that redemption is not necessarily the redemption that we expect. It's not necessarily the redemption that we yearn for, that we seek, that we can identify and that we can articulate. But rather it's a redemption that sometimes comes in other forms and nevertheless is no less a redemption than the redemption we had perhaps imagined and we had wanted to achieve. Here, all the more so. This child is not Naomi's biological grandchild. This is not the baby of her baby. This is the baby of her adopted daughter, who had been her daughter-in-law, who became her daughter through this journey. Right? And who now has delivered this baby to Naomi for Naomi to take care of. Right? Presumably. In other words, not only yes, but all the more so, right? Because these ties are ties that were created through life. And in a sense, there is an element here of a human journey of redemption that has been enabled by the circumstances. Right? Yes.
The fact that Ruth's Moabite figure into this equation that it's all about Naomi and passage you show. Is that part of it?
Does the fact that Ruth is a Moabite figure into the story? Absolutely, and we're going to talk about this. We have another 2 sessions on Ruth, and that's going to be one of the major things we're going to be looking at. So the answer is 100% yes. Ruth is a Moabite, and it is an issue for us. And at the same time, it is remarkably dealt with. It is remarkably addressed. So yes, it is an issue and it is also remarkably addressed.
I had another question, and I don't know if this is true, but I had heard over time that it used to be if you converted, you had to ask 3 times. I know that from my own mother-in-law who asked twice and no one told her she had to ask 3 times. And I thought it went back to Ruth in that there's 3 times when Ruth asks. She claims once but speaks twice. And I didn't know if there's any basis for that, if that's just
So we're going to talk about this too. While we talk about Ruth being a Moabite, we're also going to talk about conversion, and the question is whether there's a conversion that takes place here. I'm again reformulating your question, and whether the requirements for conversion are met by the story of Ruth, who doesn't ask 3 times, who asks twice, but who walks along with Naomi back to her home, back to her country, and so on and so forth. We're going to talk about conversion a great deal. Hold on to that question. The simple answer to that question is that conversion does not yet exist. There isn't yet conversion. Conversion we come to in the Greco-Roman world. Conversion is not yet with us. You're a Moabite, you're a Moabite. Right? So the prospect of conversion is not even yet here. Right? And we're going to talk about that a great deal. And we're going to think about it. And it's quite remarkable that throughout the biblical period, we don't hear about conversion. There is no such thing as conversion. There is a theological change, right, that occurs with people. But with regard to these people who live through a change, such a major change in their lives, what do we read about? Arami Oved Avi, my father is a wandering Aramean. He remains an Aramean, that father, right? He's never, he never transcends being an Aramean. So we're going to talk about all of that. So we asked about redemption. We asked about familial notions of redemption and how redemption takes place. We have talked about conversion and identity. Are there any other questions so far? One more.
Do Bible scholars feel that this was perhaps written by a woman, the whole book of Ruth?
The book of Ruth, to the best of our knowledge, was redacted. We believe that it was redacted in the 4th or 3rd centuries before the Common Era. The likelihood of it being redacted by a woman is very, very low. However, very low, very low. The question was whether the book of Ruth was written by a woman. However, there are pieces of this that very likely were written by a woman or by women. There are things here that I am not sure would have been written by a man. And remember especially the way the story starts. The very beginning of the book of Ruth, as we said last time, it's all about men. Right? Elimelech, Machlon, and Chilion, their family going out because of a drought from Bethlehem to the country of Moab, and within 3 verses, it becomes a story of women. Right? I'm afraid I have to leave you. Thank you for bearing with me today. Thank you for allowing me to run through this quickly. Thank you for being on the journey with me, and I look forward to seeing you next week.